physiologically intimidated, this being some great competitive strategy for males who could pump out just the right kind of suppressive pheromones. In other species, though, what you see is a sudden burst of sperm production. And what's that about? Another version of the same logic. This is a counter strategy. If males have come up, evolved the means in various rodent species to generate pheromones that will drive down testosterone levels in opponents, what males also want to have evolved was some mechanism of, when smelling those sorts of pheromones, to try to counter that by increasing sperm production. What we have here is a co-evolutionary arms race. In terms of interactions of pheromones between the sexes, and what I've been doing here is describing all this without making use of this. So what you see is physiologically when the female is the pheromone donor and the other recipient is a female, in terms of, say, puberty, decreasing puberty onset. And what we just saw with male as donor versus male is in some ways suppressing some endpoints testosterone, in some ways increasing sperm production. What you see in lots of rodent species when you're looking at between genders, when males are the source of pheromones among rodents, it accelerates puberty onset in the females. And when you've got females as the donors, it increases testosterone level and sperm production in the males of lots of different species. So all this makes wonderful, wonderful sort of sociobiological sense in terms of how this should work. Elaborations on this, of course. What you also see is not only puberty onset and being regulated, you also see in all sorts of species where you can induce ovulation by sensory stimuli. What you see is the smell of a female will decrease the likelihood of induced ovulation. Female, the smell of a male will increase the likelihood of ovulation. All sorts of species that do not have automatic rhythms of ovulation cycles of that way, but rather they are induced. And one classic example of that are pigs. Pigs are inducible ovulators, if you've always wondered whether that's the case or not. And you can go and recreationally buy a variant of pig pheromone, this known as boar mate. And no doubt that's not only patent pended, but somewhere out in the Midwest, there's all sorts of TV jingles about boar mate. And boar mate is a ovulation inducer in female boars, and involving a same male-derived pheromone, which are found in truffles. Truffles which somehow have stumbled on the means to induce female pigs to ovulate, and no doubt that's explaining some very interesting interspecies interactions. So that being another realm. Inducible physiological changes, in this case, one classic demonstration of it, in this case, probably pheromones of a female causing an indirect measure of testosterone levels in a male. This is a classic paper, and you will note that I didn't say females and males, saying a female and a male. This was a classic paper in Nature some 30 years ago or so, which was written by the very famous and well-known Dr. Anonymous. The author's name was not published there. And this was a researcher who did research in an unspecified hemisphere with an unspecified species, but involved long stretches of being at a research facility completely on his own in isolation from other humans. And all sorts of people in the business for decades afterward have been speculating on who the author is, and it's generally understood. And what this person noted was every now and then he would pick up and go to the city that was, a 3-hour seaplane flight away or some such thing, where among other things he had a highly significant other with a great deal of physical intimacy and all that stuff from kind of the right side of the chart. And what he noticed was what he perceived to be an extraordinary difference in what he was subjectively interpreting as testosterone-driven mood and level of energy and all of that, depending on where he was. Not quite being the type of field ethologist that took blood from himself, what he did instead was take an indirect assay, building on the well-known fact that testosterone has something to do with the rate of beard growth. And what he wound up doing was very soon having a razor there and every day shaving and getting the little bits of stubble and weighing it. weighing it as an indirect assay of testosterone levels, and what was shown was sit out there by himself with whatever ungulates he was obsessing over and this sort of rate of beard growth, go back to the rest of the world and it does this, and this square wave going on like that. This as a very, okay, what are all the confounds here? It's not clear if it was pheromones, maybe it was actually being in proximity to the newspaper in the town that he returned to now and then. Maybe there was a confound of whatever aftershave he was using that was doing something rather to his testes. Nonetheless, generally interpreted as this being a really interesting indirect N=1 example of induction of physiological changes in human males by pheromones from females. So if you ever meet Dr. Anonymous, who interestingly has been publishing papers for about 300 years or so every now and then, congratulate that individual on the research. Okay, so pheromonal stuff. Now elaborations of it, which you should be able to derive all on your own from some of our principles by now, which is what if, for example, you are a female donor and female recipient, the logic here being decrease the likelihood of ovulation, delay the onset of puberty. What if these are siblings? If these are two sisters and you are often running with that one, it will not work as effectively. Easy kin selection argument. So all sorts of aspects of relatedness. You will not have your testosterone levels driven up if you were a hamster and you were smelling your sister, all that sort of thing. That makes perfect sense by now. Okay, now switching over, one last piece of business though, in terms of the pheromonal attractiveness stuff, a handful of studies showing that among homosexual men, what you have is it's the smell of men who are preferred to women, and it's when men have higher testosterone levels that they are preferred. And what we've got there is a exact same physiology and a somewhat going in the opposite direction, flipping of things that sure argues for some interesting biological underpinnings. One final thing, women not only prefer the smell of men when they, around the time that they are ovulating, their noses selectively become more sensitive to such smells, and estrogen has all sorts of receptors on olfactory neurons. So that makes sense. Okay, leaping over to other sensory systems, gustatory stimuli. This is not one of the more exciting outposts unless you are something like a giraffe, in which case you take part in what is called phlegming, a good old Germanic ethological term, which is you want all sorts of interesting reproductive information on somebody else, and you just don't have the time to sniff the air for pheromones. So what you do is you go over and lick the individual's private parts, and suddenly you know, oh, so much about their personal lives. In this case, gustatory information being passed. We've already heard about examples of auditory priming, inducible ovulation in various moose-like species in the wilds of Minnesota, where the stags have these roaring fixed action patterns, which will induce all sorts of ovulatory responses in females around. So this is another domain. Remember also that interesting factoid when this was mentioned previously, that in human females, voices get a little bit higher around the time of ovulation and in a way that is detectable. Something important in terms of all this pheromonal stuff in humans, what has been shown over and over and over again is these are all subliminal processes. As in, the humans are not consciously aware of, wow, this one smells more like my gonadally intact second cousin who was adopted away to Bolivia for a while when I was a kid. There's not the consciousness, but nonetheless, you force people to make these choices, and implicitly, you get insight into these same sort of influences. But, of course, by the time you get to humans, and you talk about sensory releasers and all of that, you get, of course, the point endlessly emphasized by Cosmo and God knows where else, that ultimately the most erogenous organ in humans is the brain. Thought as a releaser, thought as a more powerful. Humans are not a particularly olfactory species. We are not a particularly great auditory one, etc., etc. An awful lot of the sexual priming in humans coming by way of thought, bypassing this whole ethological world. Okay, more environmental factors, acute environmental factors that can affect all of this. And what you've got is a very reliable way to drive down libido is to make an organism terrified. Fear as suppressive of reproductive behavior. What you also have is extreme rage doing the same. Stress in general. Stress is interesting because what you get is a dichotomous outcome. Chronic stress. So now we're not talking about an acute stressor, but all the way back, chronic stress is extremely suppressive of reproductive physiology and behavior, which you will be finding out when you read the relevant chapter in the Zebra's book. But what you see is short term, there's a lot more variability, particularly among males. What you see is a lot of variability as to whether short-term stress stimulates arousal or inhibits it. And people have pointed out all sorts of horrific bits of evidence showing in circumstances of extreme arousal and stress, say during warfare, where that produces all sorts of violent sexual behavior, no shortage of horrible historical precedents for those. Okay, so a difference between chronic stress versus acute stress, more effects around here. One final interesting bit of releasing stimuli, whatever a bit of a stimulus is, and one that transcends a particular sensory system is something called the Coolidge effect. And the Coolidge effect probably accounts for like 49% of the misery encapsulated in human literature and movies and all of that. What is the Coolidge effect? In species after species after species, you take an individual who is sexually sated, which is to say that, for example, you've got some male rodent who's been mating with a female rodent there and has gotten to the point where he has had enough on some physiological level or some deeply emotional, what matters to me in my life, rodential sort of level. But in any case, the male is sated, has stopped having sex with the female. And what the Coolidge effect is about is you put in a different female and things start all over again. Variety as wildly stimulating of sexual arousal, and the Coolidge effect sure works in humans and accounts for all sorts of misery. Coolidge, by the way, was not the scientist who first described it, but Coolidge refers to Calvin Coolidge, and as far as I know, this is the only anecdote ever to occur about the guy, something where he and his wife were being shown some chicken farm and they were breeding roosters, and when they would get sick of breeding with this hen, they would stick a new one in, and Mrs. Coolidge made some sarcastic remark and he made one back, and before you knew it, it was the Great Depression. So I actually have no memory of what they said, but in terms of wittiness, you get what you can when you have Calvin Coolidge. So, okay, we hurtle on. We hurtle on here, now beginning to look at an entire missing category here in my rush. Now we have what's going on with hormones, longer term hormonal stuff, not the hormone levels that you have influenced as a result of sexual behavior, not the hormone levels just right around the time of all this neurobiology happening, but now beginning to talk about hormone levels like over the last 28 days or so in a female. And what one immediately barrels into is this issue of how much is sexual behavior in women a function of where you are in your cycle. What's the reason even to suspect that? The entire world of other species that will have females coming into estrus, coming into heat, having elevated estrogen levels only at very demarcated times of the year. And what you see is in lots of species, a large number of them, in fact, what you see is you only get reproductive behavior, you only get sexual behavior in females around the time that they are ovulating. You only get active female proceptive seeking of sex around those times. By the time you get to non-human primates, it depends on the species you're looking at, but in general, it's not quite as tight of a relationship. So if you had some rodent and across a year, this was all the points of ovulation, your pattern of sexual behavior of a female would look like this. likelihood of mating with a male. By the time you get to non-human primates, in most species, it looks more like that. It's not quite as dramatic. And thus, of course, the question becomes, where do humans fit in on this? And a classic study, extremely influential, in the early 70s was the first to look at this, which was females, humans, women, reporting their levels of sexual activity, as well as the likelihood of orgasm per sexual bout, if that's the right word, and where they were in the cycle. So this is what you wound up seeing, and this, by any measure, likelihood of having sex, whatever, the curve looked something like this. And what they reported was a big increase around the time of day 14 and a secondary increase around day 28. Not as large of one, and when you looked at the likelihood of orgasm, it was basically doing the same exact thing. Okay, day 14, that's just a somewhat less restricted version of the exact same phenomenon. Never down to zero, but nonetheless, this is another version of this exact same phenomenon, libido, sexual proceptivity, increasing in women, in human females around the time of ovulation. But no other species shows this one going on here. So what's up with that? Any speculation why you had the secondary increase around day 28? Oh, come on, somebody's got to... Yes, you're right. That's exactly what they found. That's exactly what they found, and good for you feeling comfortable speaking up in class all in unison like that. Okay, what that tends to be is that women are more relaxed about fear of pregnancy around the time of their period, and thus sexual behavior increases somewhat around that point. But the thing that everybody most importantly...
You fucking idiot!
Just like every other mammal out there that has regular cycling or only seasonal ones, high estrogen is when you get the most sexual behavior. Okay, instead of high estrogen is the only time you get sexual behavior, instead you simply get the most around that. In the years since, lots of people have done versions on this study, and it is frequently difficult to replicate this phenomenon in terms of a change in levels of sexual activity in women around the time of ovulation. What has remained very clear in the literature, though, is that sexual arousal increases around the time of ovulation in women. Very reliable effect. And what that is interpreted as is behavior here may not be telling you anywhere near as much as motivation, arousal, proceptivity at that time, and that's a more pure measure of what's going on physiologically there, what's going on in the brains. Fitting with that is a very interesting literature suggesting that women act a little bit differently in terms of proceptive sexual signaling around the time of ovulation. Studies showing, for example, that women, as assessed by both women and men, women on the average wear more provocative clothing around the time that they are ovulating. Yes, people go and study things like this for a living. These were not big effects. But the all-time bizarre study I've ever heard of in this domain was actually published with a straight face by this guy, and he's an evolutionary psychologist, University of New Mexico, a guy named Jeffrey Miller, who reported the following, and what he was spending his time doing, which he reported was that around the time of ovulation, lap dancers get larger tips. Okay, that has since been replicated in E. coli and in various yeast species, and I'm not going to try to unpack that one in any sort of way, but nonetheless, this was reported and shows you just how wonderful it could be to be a scientist. Can you imagine that money was being spent on that, your research dollars, instead of strafing people in Kandahar province or something? Okay, so we have a peek there, this general issue of what does hormonal cyclicity in a time scale of weeks to months, what does that do to sexual behavior in various species? What does that do to sexual arousal, proceptivity? What are some of the building blocks of that? Estrogen, as estrogen levels go up, estrogen increases the expression of receptors for progesterone. So you can immediately begin to piece that apart in at least two different ways. First one being estrogen, thus increasing the sensitivity in the brain. This is a brain effect. Sensitivity to progesterone, which has something to do with the
why the fuck are you guys going?
Come sex. You can also translate that into molecular biology. Estrogen, being a steroid hormone, is going to bind to its receptor and do the whole transcription factor translocation sort of thing, telling you that upstream of the gene for the progesterone receptor is a promoter that's responsive to estrogen. And estrogen receptors, you know how this one works by now. More pieces of it. Estrogen, when rising here, also increases the synthesis of oxytocin. Back to all that social bonding stuff. And what that suggests, I don't know if it has been studied, but that women will feel more affiliative with someone they've had sex with if around the time of ovulation than at other points. That is certainly the case with a vole, but that is certainly the case because they don't mate the rest of the time. And because male voles suddenly are expressive around there in terms of their feelings. Okay, so more building blocks of it. Estrogen is not only having effects in the brain, but it's also having effects throughout the body at those times in terms of lowering the threshold of certain tactile receptors. What does that mean? That means around the time that women are ovulating, thanks to estrogen, they are more sensitive to touch. And I'm sure this has been studied in consenting hamsters, but my bet is that more sensitive to tactile stimulation in some parts of the body over others. What estrogen also is doing, as we just heard, is working on the olfactory system, lowering thresholds for detecting the smell of males. So we've got all sorts of ways within the brain and in the periphery to bias towards more arousal at that time. Wonderful evolutionary biology, no problem at all. One additional piece of the female story, which is the effects over the course of this kind of time span, weeks to months to years or so, the effects of those androgens, those male sex hormones that females are releasing. And what you see there is that plays a role in proceptivity, increasing sexual arousal, sexual motivation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the road, we got males. And what does testosterone over this time span, what does it have to do with sexual behavior in males? Well, on first pass, it sure looks like it has a lot to do with it. What sort of evidence? Initially, correlative evidence. Well, the time of year in various species where males do their mating is the time of year when testosterone levels are elevated. Over the lifespan, testosterone levels go up around puberty, and from about age 30 on, very gently cascade down into alarming senescence. And what you see there is a similar profile in terms of sexual behavior. That does not tell us much. These are correlations. Furthermore, correlative studies in humans, a handful showing more sexually active men tend to have higher testosterone levels. And for what it's worth, a number of studies have documented a dramatic drop in testosterone levels in men right around the time that they become fathers. Okay, so figure that one out. Also an increase in vasopressin levels at that time. You know how to interpret this one by now. So we've got testosterone and higher levels of male sexual behavior going hand in hand. Are we looking at any causality here? First off, we already know about one piece of causality, which was the other day, sexual behavior in men, in males, increases testosterone levels. So that's one reason why they may go hand in hand. In that scenario, testosterone has nothing to do with increasing the likelihood of the behavior. So does testosterone actually have a causal role in increasing the likelihood of male sexual behavior? And the answer is yes. And how do you show it? With the most simple classic way of doing something in an endocrine study, which is get rid of the guy's testosterone. and you castrate the male, your rodent male, your non-human primate male, and what you see is there's a big drop
No, that's not why.
in levels of sexual behavior. And this could range from male lever pressing to get access to a female, to courtship displays, to extent of pomading of hair or something in the right neighborhoods. And whatever the measure is, this is when normal testosterone levels are on board, and this is after castration, a very, very dramatic drop. Now, to fulfill the second ironclad requirement in endocrinology, the last thing you need to do now is, after the subtraction experiment, to do a replacement one. Artificially give back the normal levels to the castrated individual, and levels of sexual behavior go back to there. Whoa, okay, that proves it. We have a causal relationship here. Not so fast. First thing to note, which is 0% testosterone, and sexual behavior goes way, way down, it doesn't go to zero. In every species looked at, starting with the embarrassing sexual behavior of everyone's pet dogs when they were 6 years old, even after being neutered, what you see is there's a level of residual sexual behavior. Rodents, dogs, primates, including humans. This is a critical point. How much residual sexual behavior is there after castration? The more sexual experience before castration, the more there is going to be retained afterward. In other words, on a certain totally artificial level, this amount of sexual behavior is being driven by testosterone. This amount, which persists here, is being driven by social experience. It's got nothing to do with the hormones. Yes, this is ridiculous dichotomizing into this, but the fact that it doesn't go to zero, and the fact that the more sexual experience pre-castration, the more residual behavior, this is a vote for just how much of a role social experience, social conditioning plays. Next thing that takes away from the, yes, it's all caused by testosterone. Now you do an elaboration on the study. You castrate a male, and now, instead of replacing with 100% of normal levels, you give 10% of normal levels. Or you give 200% of normal levels. And what do you wind up seeing? If testosterone plays a strictly causative role, even in this range, you are going to get something, this is going to be lower than 100%, and this is going to be higher. That's not what you see. Instead, it is something like that. You get roughly the same reinstatement of sexual behavior with when you return testosterone levels over anything roughly approximating the normal physiological range. What does that tell you? The brain circuits we learned about the other day involved in sexual motivation, it requires testosterone around to work fully, not entirely, but to work fully, but those brain regions are not really all that concerned with the exact level of testosterone. Rough approximation of normal has the exact same effect. If you were seeing a tight relationship in a male between the amount of sexual behavior and testosterone levels, it's not because every little smidgen bit of more testosterone is going to drive more sexual behavior. It's because every little additional smidgen of behavior is going to drive higher testosterone levels. So we've got this really important observation. Yes, testosterone is needed in species after species, including humans, for the normal range of sexual behavior. Just as importantly, castration never drops it down to zero, the more social experience, that whole song and dance. And very importantly as well, the system is not sensitive to little differences in testosterone levels. Stating that a different way, if some guy has 1.5% more testosterone on board than the guy sitting next to him, or than he had last week, is that going to mean he is going to be more sexually motivated, more aroused? No, not at all. Within the normal range, the system doesn't distinguish it. The relevant brain regions are sensitive to testosterone and require it, but do not care a whole lot about the levels. One exception, which is if you instead of say 200% push testosterone levels like 1,000%, tenfold higher than normal, this is supra-physiological, which means it's out of the normal range, which means no bodies normally generate those sorts of levels. Put it up in that range and you will get an increase in sexual behavior and sexual arousal. When do you see this? The idiots who go and abuse anabolic steroids for their weightlifting or whatever, people doing that are not pushing up their testosterone levels into the higher range of what human bodies can generate. They are pushing it way above the normal range. In that range, you do see an increase in sexual proceptivity. In a week or so, what we will see is the exact same story. It will be the exact same chart here when asking the question, what does testosterone have to do with aggression? And what you'll see is the exact same conclusions. What are we beginning to see here? That testosterone is not playing a strictly causative role. It is playing one of the words that should be becoming repetitive here and clearly really important. Testosterone is playing a modulatory role. What testosterone does is sensitize you towards stimuli that are evocative of sexual arousal. It lowers the threshold. And that could be shown in all sorts of studies, but where it's most clear-cut is in this case. Does testosterone cause this sexual behavior? No, but when it is on board, it facilitates it, it modulates it. Theme again and again and again. And that obviously has tons to do with individual differences. One last hormone to mention in this realm of hormone levels over the last couple of weeks, months, seasons or so, the hormone melatonin, and I think that's the only time melatonin is going to be mentioned in class. Melatonin has something to do with telling the body what time of year it is. It is responsive to the amount of light you were exposed to. What is melatonin about? It is one of the driving forces on seasonal mating. Those species where you suddenly get on one afternoon each year, all the wildebeest ovulate the same afternoon kind of thing. It is almost certainly a whole pathway in the brain sensitive to the amount of light and the amount of light per day over recent weeks, which by way of melatonin triggers the onset of the mating season. Do humans have a seasonal mating pattern? There's a smidgen of evidence for it. If we've got it, it is a very, very weak echo of what you see in some other species. Okay, now we shift over to getting really way back then. Instead of over your last 28 days or over the last 3 seasons, now beginning to look at perinatal factors. Perinatal, before birth, prenatal, after birth, postnatal, very early development. First off, focusing on early environmental factors having something to do with adult sexual behavior. What we can translate that into is ways in which early environment affects every single one of these subsequent ones. What does early environment, childhood, have to do with shaping of sexual behavior? A theme that's also going to come out in every topic we're going to hear of after this, buzzwords that should be beginning to be keeping you awake at night, modulatory, contingent, if then, all that stuff. Here's another one, here's another concept that comes through. The evidence shows that there is very little about early life experience which influences the quality, the way in which an organism goes about having sex. What's another way of stating it? This is a pretty set in stone bunch of fixed action patterns. Early experience is not about learning how to be sexual. Early experience is about learning the appropriate social contexts for being so. And that is shown in species after species. That is what experience is about, not how to do it, but when to do it and who you should not in your right mind try to do something proceptive to and things of that sort. This is what early experience is about. And what we're going to see in a week is the exact same boring paragraph. Early experience does not teach organisms how to be aggressive. It teaches organisms the appropriate context for being aggressive. So what's the sort of evidence for this, for these early effects? One example, a whole literature that emerged that is covered somewhat in the Zebra book in another domain, but this whole literature that emerged in the 1950s, work looking at captive primates, what are the consequences of growing up in a certain degree of social isolation? What happens to behavior? And eventually, people studying behavior and physiology, what happens to behavior in adulthood if you are a young rhesus monkey who grows up only with peers and no mother, or grows up only with a mother and no peers, or grows up with mother being present only intermittently, or at the most extremes, growing up with neither mother nor peers or any other member of your species around. You will see in the book a whole discussion of the ethics of these studies, but what does your early social environment have to do with things like sexual behavior? And what you see coming out the end is when you looked at these adult primates, since replicated over and over, they go about the sexual behavior the plain old way that everybody else does, but they do it in totally socially inappropriate context. And thus you have these males who were raised in some degree of isolation early on, growing up and carrying out perfectly normal sexual fixed action patterns on the towel in the room, on the bowl of food, on the who knows what wrong context. You have trying to do things with animals you should not go anywhere near in terms of social dominance and such, inappropriate context. Early experience shaping not how, but when, what the if-then clauses are. More issues of early experience shaping adult sexual behavior, arousal, proceptivity, etc. We already heard one example of this with humans. That's the whole kibbutz literature. That was that whole business that if you spend lots of intimate time with somebody before age 6, what you will do is in some subliminal imprinting way decide forever after, this individual does not feel like a potential mate, this individual feels like a sibling. That was the example in the Recognizing a Relative lecture of showing that, hooray, we are such a cognitively sophisticated species, we can figure out who somebody's fourth cousin 3 steps removed is by thinking, and that's how we make our mating decisions, showing instead in those studies there is this non-conscious level. One of the rules that humans have is lots of exposure intimately to somebody early on in life, and you are not going to be very likely to get that proceptive behavior stuff going on later, part of turning them into a pseudo-kin because of that early exposure. One additional domain I will touch on here in terms of early experience, which is what does early experience have to do with sexual orientation? And depending on which decade you are asking this question, the answer would range from everything to virtually nothing. Going back to the virtually everything time, which was dominating sort of the first half of the 20th century, how people thought about the subject, what you had were 2 broad models for what sort of early environments increased the likelihood of boys becoming gay as adults. And these were the 2 models. The first one was the absence of a father figure model. And this was one straight out of monkeys learning who they should try to pelvic thrust with or some such thing. This was the argument that what do father figures provide? Training for appropriate contexts for proceptive sexual behavior, growing up absent a father figure, increasing the likelihood of being gay. The other model was having this totally pain in the neck, neurotic, screwed up mother, who, as basically said between the lines, makes you crazy when you grow up, and thus you have, circa 1950, psychiatrically certifiable disorder of having a different sexual orientation. Obviously, where I'm going to head right now is there has not been a slightest shred of evidence over the years either for the missing father figure model of sexual orientation or the neurotic mothering style model. Complete nonsense. Nonetheless, dominating thinking about what was going on there. Okay, so what we are now ready to shift to is what's going on with hormones around this time period. Let's take our 5-minute break and then we'll resume. Looking at what perinatal hormone levels have to do with adult sexual behavior.
Why are you engaging?
And you already know the
People are fucking
answer. You
idiots.
know it in your hearts by now, which is, well, it depends on what species you're looking at. And what we will see is a very similar thing to the rule there, which is in lots of species, rodent species, prenatal or perinatal hormonal environment has everything to do with adult sexual behavior. And by the time we get to humans, what we'll see is maybe kind of sort of more research needed. What we begin with here, implicit in that, is a dichotomy that runs through all of endocrinology when thinking about behavior. The effects of hormones back when you were little, jargon in the field, an organizational effect of the hormone. And what that is about is explicitly is what are hormones doing at a time in terms of organizing what kind of brain you're developing there. Effects of hormones instead in this range or so, what you were talking about is an activational hormonal effect. So this is a very sort of consistent dichotomy that people in the business use. Early hormonal environments having organizational effects on the nervous system, hormones forever after having activational effects. So what you see is in rodent species that perinatal hormone exposure has massive organizational effects that dramatically influence sexual behavior. What you also see is it's not so dramatic and clear-cut. A whole literature initially suggesting that, for example, male rodents, if they are not exposed to testosterone perinatally, will have a different male rodent sexual orientation later on, a dichotomous outcome. What a huge literature now shows is something that is evident to every sort of human sexologist for centuries, which is it's not a dichotomous function. It is on a continuum in terms of sexual orientation, and 300 different species have been documented by now to have both heterosexual and homosexual behavior at different times in naturalistic settings. So perinatal hormones having organizing effects on adult sexual orientation, what you see is these are not all or none properties at all. What else? Okay, what you see specifically in non-human primates is perinatal period. Expose a female monkey fetus to high testosterone levels, and what you will do is masculinize the brain. Masculinize the brain, having thus an organizational effect. What does masculinization then manifest itself as in adulthood? If nothing else is different, it has no effects at all. On the other hand, if you inject a female monkey who is masculinized perinatally, if you inject her with androgens, with testosterone, you get a wild burst of male fixed action patterns. In other words, you've got an if-then clause. If
What the
and
fuck are
only
you?
If there was prenatal masculinization, then
I don't like this game.
testosterone will have an acute activational effect
motherfuckers.
on sexual behavior.
I honestly don't
Okay,
understand
translating this. Okay. Okay, so in the absence, in a normal female monkey, in the absence of prenatal androgens or adult androgen levels, this is the amount of male fixed action pattern sexual behavior. Now, prenatal androgenization, normal low androgen levels in adulthood, same low levels. Now, no prenatal androgenization,
No, it's just
and
'cause these idiots
exposure
fucking
to
decided to
androgens
go.
in adulthood, same low levels, prenatal
Why the
exposure
fuck
and
would they
acute
even-
activation of effects, and suddenly you get high rates of male typical fixed action patterns. So what we've got here is a contingent organizational effect, yet again one of our if-then clauses, this one not being a if this physiology is going on only in this social environment, then this is if this early life endocrine environment occurs coupled with this acute adult one, then. Yeah. That is a great question, and as you're about to see, the answer is so insanely complicated, you are going to regret having asked that question for days, but you were going to find out about it anyway. Apropos of that, I just forgot a great question during the break, which is, okay, when you've got those weightlifter folks, they're abusing their steroids, their anabolic steroids, their testosterone-derived drugs, when you push things up into the supra physiological range, higher than the body normally ever comes up with, do you see a phenomenon from last Wednesday? Does the body down-regulate the number of testosterone receptors? And you see exactly the case, but you could never down-regulate them low enough to compensate for the huge screening testosterone signal. It is a partially successful compensatory response. Okay, what have you got in terms of humans, in terms of perinatal androgenization of females? And people used to know exactly the answer to it. First off, when do you get human females as fetuses, and it's predominantly in humans prenatal rather than postnatal effects? It depends on sort of how fast, how much development occurs before birth. But in humans, when are circumstances where female fetuses will get heavily androgenized? Historically, two circumstances. One is in the case of a disease where there is something wrong with the adrenal glands and they pump out tons of testosterone. You remember, if I actually did say this, and if I didn't, I hope you're not remembering it hallucinatorily, but you'll remember that the adrenal glands make a certain amount of testosterone, and in females, it pumps out maybe 5% the levels that males do. When you have this disease of an overactive adrenal system, you pump out way too high of levels of testosterone, a disease called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Hyperplasia, the number of cells. Okay, come up with a limerick about that one, I dare you. Is it possible to come up with a haiku? How many syllables are there in congenital adrenal hyperplasia? Well, depends if we're talking about rodents or not. So, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, a genetic and inborn error of metabolism in the adrenal glands, and you pump out huge amounts of androgen. So suddenly there is a world of the occasional girl who was born suffering from this disorder, or the mother suffering from it during pregnancy, who has been prenatally androgenized. The other population, thanks to a drug that was very popular in the 1950s, a drug that decreased the likelihood of miscarriage, that was very heavily used at points around then, a drug called diethylstilbestrol, DES, and in a subset of women, their biochemistry was such that a lot of the DES was converted to androgens. So you had kids who were prenatally androgenized girls, either because of this congenital adrenal hyperplasia or because of DES exposure. So then the question immediately becomes, okay, so what are they like afterward? And this prompted the great, large, massive set of studies on the CAH, the congenital adrenal hyperplasia, on the CAH girls as they grow up, and you knew exactly what the expectation was, straight out of primates here, non-human primates, which was this was going to have masculinizing effects on their behavior. And what was shown was, in adulthood, there were all sorts of differences. No, not just in adulthood. Starting around adolescence, there were all sorts of differences in the behaviors of these girls. And as we'll see next week, a whole cluster of them were thought to fall into the realm of aggressive behavior. But what was seen here was eventually a higher likelihood of becoming a lesbian in terms of sexual orientation. Whoa, what we've just shown is prenatal androgens, and you produce a lesbian later on. That's just, there was a little problem with these studies, a slight confound, and one that's going to be very pertinent next week as well when talking about the aggression stuff. The confound being, if you were prenatally androgenized, you would get born with kind of weirdo genitals. And you would have sort of intersexual genitals in all sorts of ways, and all of these girls typically had to have gone through a dozen rounds of reconstructive plastic surgery over the first decade of your life. These were not girls where the only thing different about them was what sort of hormones their brains were marinating in back when they were fetuses. These are girls who grow up with this really interesting part of the body that all sorts of people seem kind of creeped out about, that doctors are endlessly examining, and all sorts of painful surgeries. And this literature was completely confounded by the fact that there was all this masculinization of genitalia and a whole world of surgeries, often confusion about gender assignment early on in life. Things were not merely a change in the hormone levels. So it remains relatively unclear. There's by now, at this point, weak evidence of prenatal androgenization increasing the likelihood of a woman being gay as an adult. I'm seeing here in my notes, I have the words Indonesia, tomboy, and Hobson Jobson. And I haven't a clue what that's about. So we will just skip over that. Okay. What we begin to see here is another feature of early experience. What does, where are we, prenatal endocrine environment have to do with sexual identification, which is different than who you are sexually attracted to, but rather what sex you feel yourself to be. And what we heard the other day with the transsexualism example is you could have gender being dictated by your chromosomes and which organ, which types of gonads you have and hormones and all of that, but that is not enough to determine it. There are clearly other things that can happen that could produce a very, very different gender identity. What also was seen from that literature of individuals who were born intersexual, where they have sexually ambiguous, gender ambiguous genitalia, is it is far from clear which decision to make, whether that was made circa 1950s by the surgeon with no consultation with the parents, or fortunately these days a very different scenario in terms of how successful the assignment is by the individuals in the outside world, what's going on in terms of sexual identity inside. Now, what this begins to bring up is the most miserable, irritating, confusing thing about the effects of steroid hormones in the brain, which is where your question came from. And this is where you're all going to start to regret this, but it actually is necessary in terms of an important point. Okay, so you got testosterone. And what does testosterone do? We know already it binds to testosterone receptors. Okay, testosterone receptor, and does its steroid hormone transcription factor deal. Throughout the 1970s, there was astonishing amount of confusing, irritated research done showing the two following things. In some parts of the body, testosterone has its effect as testosterone. It binds to the testosterone receptor. In some parts of the body, there is biochemical conversion of testosterone to something called dihydrotestosterone. Okay, it's not testosterone, it's a little bit different chemically, it binds to the same testosterone receptors, it works a little bit differently, okay, we can live with that. The thing that had people jumping off buildings was the discovery at the time that some of testosterone's actions are due to it being biochemically converted to estrogen, which then binds to estrogen receptors and causes male typical behaviors. Okay, it's at this point that about half the people in the field quit and went to business school because this was so confusing and impossible and all of that. This consumed years of labor of people trying to sort this one out. It goes as follows. Once testosterone enters a target cell, if this is the scenario that's going to happen, it's inside the cell that testosterone is turned to estrogen. In other words, this weirdo phenomenon has no effect on circulating testosterone levels. It's only in target cells that have the enzyme that could do that conversion. Okay, so it's an intracellular phenomenon. If this is leaving you totally in the dust, don't worry about it, except for a small point coming in a while. But if you want to devote the rest of your life to figuring this out in more detail, there's something wrong with you. But what you've got here is normal circulating levels, but different effects throughout the body. In general, what is found is the effects of testosterone in the brain involve this turning it into estrogen, as symbolized meaninglessly by that asterisk. Throughout the genitals, or throughout the body, and secondary sexual areas of skin and such, testosterone exerts its effects by being turned into dihydrotestosterone. And whatever parts are left over at that point, testosterone just does its regular old thing. Okay, so this is incredibly confusing how this can be. Immediately, or not so immediately, two things should come to mind. Okay, so prenatal testosterone levels are going about their normal prenatal organizational masculinization effects, and part of it is on how the brain organizes.
I'm going to show you exactly step by step
what
to do.
we just saw was
you can still see the lights and the shades,
and
that's still going to block your screen.
To be working like estrogen in the brain.
So What you do is you come down here,
Why don't
make
all
sure
the
that the
female
key color is in
fetuses
green.
then get androgenized?
You can use
Since
blue,
they're not
magenta,
generating
or another
estrogen
color.
right on site there within the cell, but they're
From
getting
what I've
estrogen through
researched,
some
green
other
is the
route
best one
as
to,
their fetal
remove
ovaries start to
backgrounds.
work.
So,
Why isn't mom and
go
her
ahead and make sure that that's on
estrogen
green.
androgenizing
Then we
every
start off
single
with
fetus
similarity,
out there? How is it
and you just
possible
want to
to
go
ever get a
ahead
female?
and
And the answer to
toggle this
that
to the
is
right,
there is a
and
protein
you can see the back.
which occurs during pregnancy that occurs in the circulation. And what it does is it binds estrogen and it takes it out of action. It leads to estrogen being degraded. In other words, estrogen in the bloodstream of a fetus never has an effect on any cells in the body. Estrogen, whether derived from the female fetus, beginning to get her ovaries going there, or from mom's circulation, the estrogen has no effect. In other words, the only fetuses that ever have estrogen inside their neurons are fetuses that are male, where the estrogen came from testosterone. So you have to have this protein, and it's something called alpha-fetoprotein. It only occurs in fetal life. This winds up being the solution. What is implicit in that? You do not get the organizational, feminizing effects of hormones prenatally because of estrogen, because you've just guaranteed that doesn't happen. You're getting androgenizing effects that way. You don't get prenatal feminizing effects from estrogen. Where does the brain feminization come from? The irritating answer back when was this was always
go ahead and make sure that that's on green.
Used, that the
Then we start off
brain
with
is a
similarity,
default brain.
and you just want to
You
go
have to
ahead and
actively
toggle this to the right,
muscular, excited,
and you can see the
know,
background's going away
chopping
right
down the
now.
trees and clearing the prairie sort of way. You have to actively do something hormonal to masculinize a brain, and in the absence of that, you just kind of wind up with one of them female brains. What's clear now is this default model is not really the case. It's other hormones that are doing that there. Okay, so this totally confusing, irritating thing that everybody had to assimilate at the time of testosterone having different effects, having been converted to different messengers in different parts of the body, and that having to produce this whole complex, Rube Goldberg sort of solution as to how to ever get a female. Now, one additional interesting